everyone. I am so glad you're here today. Actually, the first 3 sessions just build so nicely on what I'm going to talk about. So if you were in those, I think this is just going to be a great continuation. And we're going to be talking about starting your anti-racism journey. My name's Marissa. I'm a member of Living Hope Christian Center. I'm also a public health professional and in a prior life a social worker for a few years. In the chat box, that maybe Daniel can repost it for me. I've kind of linked out a Google Doc of the resources I'm going to share today, so you can access them later. And then also a link to find out what native land you're sitting on. So as we go into talking about anti-racism, I think it's really important to also acknowledge if you are in America, you are sitting on native indigenous land that was taken. And so if you're in the East Bay like I am, we're sitting on Ohlone land. And if you're not, you can click on that link and see where you're sitting just to acknowledge that. So what we're doing today, some of you, this will be well known and familiar, some will not. That's okay. No matter where you are in this learning journey, we welcome you. Some of you may be just with George Floyd and the recent events and the sermons that PB has been doing, feel compelled to kind of do something. Some of you may have been in this work in a while, for a long time, and that's we welcome you all, no matter your backgrounds. I want to start with a quote from Angela Davis, an amazing activist and scholar, where she says, in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist, we must be anti-racist. And that is the premise that this talk is based off of, and hopefully we'll show you some different ways you can be and start your anti-racism journey. Let's see, there we go. I do want to acknowledge, I couldn't fit everyone or every organization on here, but these are some of the amazing anti-racism educators and teachers and podcasts and books and organizations that I've had the privilege from learning from throughout my anti-racism journey. I wanted to make sure to acknowledge their impact and role on my journey. They're linked in the resources doc, so you have access to who they are, their works, all of that, so you can dive in later. And I want to start with this opening scripture. There's been a lot of great scriptures read today. A lot of the scripture PB's been speaking on is around justice and how the Bible speaks to that. And I think that builds so nicely to this scripture and what we're going to dive into today from 1 Corinthians 12:26. If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. So this is at the end of a passage where it's really talking about the unique gifts that each member of the church bring to the church body and the power of that. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that if one of us, God's children, inside or outside the church, are suffering, we are all suffering, and it pains God as well. And so that's the importance of being anti-racist and dismantling racism. I'm going to read this whole kind of excerpt. I know it's long, but I do think it's really important, and it sets a really good kind of summary of today's topic that I could not do on my own. And it's from Tasha Candace's Anti-Racism Resource Guide. I've linked it in the resource page. It's full of resources. If you utilize it, I encourage you to provide financial compensation through these mechanisms for their time and the value they're providing you. So what she says in her intro is, this is just a resource, not a map leading to a destination, but help along the way, a strong start. The tendency to try and get through this list in its entirety and feel accomplished, or to get overwhelmed by the ever-growing list, are real reactions we should leave behind. Again, this is lifelong work that we choose to enter into, a journey for an anti-racist traveler that will take a lifetime. Learning, relearning, and decolonizing history are all necessary pieces of this journey, but should coincide with other things like listening, taking action, financially supporting, and decentering whiteness. For those who identify as Black, Indigenous, and persons of color, BIPOC, engagement with these resources may be triggering. These materials are intended to help you further understand oppressive systems and provide more tools and resources to fight these systems while recognizing how your own bias contributes to your prejudice. For those of you who are white, engaging with these resources could bring a negative or defensive reaction. I encourage you to challenge your own culture, privilege, and bias while continuing the fight against oppressive systems that you benefit from. I truly believe that this ongoing work is a journey of empathy and care for humanity, individually and collectively. And I think that just beautifully sums up what we're going to dive into today. And we all need to be on an anti-racist journey. Part of it will look different. It will look different for white folks because we have and never will experience racism. Part of it will be different for BIPOC who do experience racism, and part of their journey may be to address internalized racism. So I'm going to start with a discussion question. Please write in the chat if you can. If you're not on computer or only audio, you're welcome to unmute yourself. But I want to hear, why are you here? What do you hope for today? The session is about starting your anti-racism journey. What about that brought you here? I'd love to hear folks chat, unmute. I can wait in silence. I was a social worker. You're skilled in that when you're in that field. Came to learn? Yeah, Grace, thank you. I do hope you learn. I hope we all learn from each other today too. Others? Why are you here? What do you hope for?
I came to learn because I know Marissa on a personal level, and everything that she's taught me in the past has helped me to grow. So I'm hoping to grow.
Thanks, Siobhan. I think a big part of anti-racism is personal growth. Joan wrote, to learn about racism and what I can do with my learnings. Yes, yes, absolutely. Brian, to learn what steps helped you along your journey and how I can support others. I want to hear more from others and learn from others. Sunny said, yes, absolutely. So I see some things about learning and growing, which is so important because those are really pillars to the journey of anti-racism, no matter who you are. Janice says, I signed up for all the sessions, excited to learn, as well as bring back ideas for how we can have similar conversations at our church. I love that. I've been really proud and impressed of Living Hope and their leadership here. And I do hope that other churches and congregations can learn from PB and Sunny and what Living Hope is doing and spread it further. Awesome. If you all want to keep writing in the chat box, that's great. We'll go ahead and move forward a little bit. So today's goals, we're going to discuss some of the ways in which the system of white supremacy prevents us from being anti-racist, discuss why anti-racism is work, conscious work, and then learn the importance of both internal action, which I'll define in a minute, and then ways to take external action. So I want to make sure we're on the same page about what we mean when we say anti-racist or anti-racism. There's tons of definitions out there. I really like these two by Dr. Robert Patterson, who says anti-racism is an active and conscious effort to work against multidimensional aspects of racism. And the NAC International Perspectives defines it as anti-racism is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies and practices, attitudes, so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. So I want to note that both of these speak of it as an active practice, a conscious effort, and we're really going to focus on that a lot today. And I also want to acknowledge it talks about power and that being redistributed and shared equally. Power is integral to racism. I'm not going to dive too much into that today. I hope as you go on your continue or start your anti-racism journey, that you will really dive into that. It's really central to how white supremacy and racism functions. And then I'm going to be using some terms around internal action, external action, and how I'm defining these for today is internal action are the actions taken to change one's mind, heart, beliefs, and opinions. This work includes educating oneself, gaining knowledge, gaining skills, honest reflection, holding yourself accountable, and ongoing internal assessment of one's biases, assumptions, beliefs, and opinions. Where external action, which is driven and informed by your internal action, are the actions taken to create external change that has an effect on individuals, communities, and families. So another discussion question. I know there's been some discussion throughout today's sessions, but I'm gonna really have a lot. So, get comfortable with being uncomfortable and sharing where you're at. What do you think prevents us from taking internal or external action to be anti-racist, right? If it was easy, we wouldn't have racism anymore. It's work. And why is that? What prevents us from doing that work taking the action? You can write in the chat, you can unmute yourself. There's no wrong answer. It could be from your own lived experience. It could be from things that you are just making a hypothesis about. What do you think? Pick out your brain, really push yourself to think about this. What prevents us from taking either internal or external action to be anti-racist? Grace says not wanting to be uncomfortable. That's a huge one, right? Our primitive brain, and I'm going to talk about the brain a lot today, really wants comfort, right? So we'll run from anything uncomfortable. Sunny, inner desire to avoid conflict with others. Yes. Right? To keep the peace, to avoid being uncomfortable. Nicole, fear of being judged or getting it wrong. Yeah, that's a huge one. That's a huge one. And hopefully what I'll share today will point to that a lot of these are actually white supremacy. The system uses these as tools to prevent us from taking action. So we might think, oh, I'm going to get wrong, so I'm not going to do anything. And that, allows racism to persist. Jenny says, fear that starting an anti-racist journey means admitting you are a racist. We are going to get to that. PB says fear of saying or doing the wrong thing, fear of being judged for being silent or canceled for speaking out the wrong way. Oh yeah, that's a big one. And particularly, I think PB's talked about this, why churches sometimes stay silent or large celebrities. Brian, feeling like we need more information. Yes, that's such a tool of white supremacy where we have this belief that we can't do anything until we're perfectly educated. But if we follow that, then we're never going to take action. Carl, hi, don't want to admit that we have a flaw. Absolutely. Matthew, not wanting to realize the outcome that I am racist. Yes, and we are going to get to that. Great. Hi, Sarah. Yes, thank you all so much. Exactly. So we're going to talk through kind of how you work through these, and we all have these. And I think it's important to show, sometimes it can feel like, oh, I'm the only one who's feeling this way, but we all have these, and I'm going to explain why. So being anti-racist is a conscious effort. And why is that? Well, I'm sharing just one aspect of white supremacy. I know for some, this is like a word that you don't like hearing or talking about. We're going to talk about it a lot today, so just buckle up. I'm going to talk about one aspect. There are many aspects of white supremacy, but today we're focusing on white supremacy as a system designed to suppress your acknowledgement, interest, investment, empathy, and action to be anti-racist, right? So of course, white supremacy is also designed to oppress Black and brown people, reward white people. But a big part of it is designed on an individual level to, no matter who you are or your race, to suppress your acknowledgement, your investment, your empathy, your action. We're also taught and messaged about racism in a way, so we think of it just in certain kind of buckets, like things like slavery, white hoods, KKK, crossbreedings, which is, racism is much, much more than that. But because we're not taught that, or it's not overtly taught, we don't really recognize it. We're also taught and reinforced through many messages that white supremacy is just personal prejudice and individual acts of discrimination. However, we need to be very clear. Someone who is a white supremacist, yes, is an individual who's racist. But white supremacy is a system that promotes and benefits from racism. So there are several ways that white supremacy functions: through other systems, through oppression, through rewarding white folks, many others. What I'm going to focus on today is our thoughts. How does the system of white supremacy really affect our thinking, which really affects our action or inaction? So each person, I'm going to get a little sciencey here. I think Sunny will enjoy this. Each person has about 12,000 to 60,000 thoughts per day, both conscious and subconscious. It averages actually higher, I think around to the 50,000. So that's a lot, and we don't even recognize it. They happen so fast, and you probably aren't even aware. I'm hoping many of you are like, that's a lot. I can't believe I'm thinking that many thoughts. So what happens when we have a thought? So you have a thought, and there are neurological signals happening in your brain. And when you think a thought, it sends a message to your body to have a physical sensation, which we call feelings. And from those feelings drive our actions. And so let me make a kind of simple example here. And we're not taught this in school. We're not taught this by our families. you've done cognitive behavioral therapy, you might be familiar. If you've done certain types of life coaching or certain meditation that teaches this. But for many folks, this is something, that you haven't learned explicitly. So let's say I'm vacationing in Tahoe and I hear a noise in the woods and I have the thought, that might be a bear. That thought, my brain might be sending signals to my body that's producing sweat, fast beating heart rate, redness in the face. That's a feeling of maybe fear. And that feeling drives my action or inaction. And it varies person to person, but maybe my decision from fear is to run. Someone else's decision from fear may be to look around, right? So that pathway happens every time we think a thought, consciously or unconsciously. So our thoughts really do drive our actions, even the ones we're not aware we're having. Where do our thoughts come from? So this is perfectly built on the technology session we had earlier, because my life coach always says, our brain is like a computer with an open source code. Anyone and everything is programming thoughts in your brain. This even happens before you're conscious. And so the thoughts that exist in our brain or are recently introduced, consciously or subconsciously, can be reinforced into unconscious beliefs, assumptions, and biases. The more we receive messaging about them, especially if we don't receive counter messages, and if we're not actively aware and able to really challenge those or really decide on purpose if we want to believe that. These messages come from everywhere: parents, society, education, school, shows you watch, what you read, everything. So, the information we're receiving during our lives promote racism in both passive and active forms. Our brain is taking in those messages, no matter who you are. If you live in America or an area that is, dominated by, history of colonization and Western culture, which is the majority of the world, you receive these messages. Our brain is taking in these messages and reprogramming them in a way that we internalize them as our beliefs or automatic thoughts. So in a white-dominated society, we're absorbing messages all the time, passively, actively, consciously, subconsciously, that white people's lives matter more, that white people are smarter, that white people succeed because they deserved it on their own merit. Where we're also receiving a lot of negative messages about Blackness and brownness and people of color, whether the messaging is that they're, these communities are lazy or violent or angry or dependent. So these internalized messages become our thoughts and beliefs, whether we know it or not, and they do drive our feelings, which drive our actions or inactions. And this is really important to know, because if you want to become actively anti-racist, this is something you're going to have to constantly address in your own mindset, in your own kind of experience going throughout. And I'm going to show an example of what I mean here. So some of you might have seen this pyramid of white supremacy. I think this is a great visual. So often, when we or America or society thinks of white supremacy or racism, we think of things you see at the top of the pyramid here: lynching, KKK, swastikas, right? And there's even stuff at the top of the pyramid that people still argue whether or not it's racist. And that's white supremacy as a system wants us to only think about those things. All the stuff at the bottom of the pyramid are also aspects of white supremacy and racism that are happening all the time, that unless we're explicitly taught or aware of, these are, again, just messages we're receiving. So let's say I'm going to give kind of a somewhat detailed but kind of vague example. Let's say you grow up in a community that looks a lot like you, but you hear a lot of messaging about another community, let's say another community of color. Whether, it's through TV or you hear comments your teachers saying or your parents saying, maybe some of it's very explicitly racist, and maybe some of it is nuanced that as a child growing up without correction and education, you don't really understand, but you keep hearing this messaging and you don't hear any messaging to counter that. Then let's say you're an adult and you're in a setting and someone makes a racist joke about that community, right? You have all these conscious and subconscious thoughts that have been kind of reiterated throughout your life about that community. So this may look different in many people, but it might be this, you hear a racist joke and you have the thought, well, I didn't think that was funny, but I don't think it's that big of a deal, right? And maybe that causes a feeling of neutrality or apathy, which causes the action of not saying anything. Or maybe you have the thought when someone says it that it's funny and you laugh, right? So this is kind of the way in which Our thinking is influenced by white supremacy and then influences our actions, especially when we are not working to be anti-racist. So this works all the way up the pyramid. So on another level, building on these unconscious beliefs and reinforced experiences, you hear about a team saying, a community saying a team's mascot is racist. You may have the thought like, I don't agree, which causes a feeling and causes an action that may be complicit or perpetrating racism. Again, moving on up to racial profiling. Maybe you're driving through a community, you see members that you have the immediate thought, am I unsafe here? Right? And then that causes a feeling and actions. All the way up to things like unjust police shootings. So maybe because of these thinking patterns, because of this reinforced messaging, when you see something recorded, you feel like you can say, yeah, that's unjust. But if you hear of something occurring and your first thoughts are, well, we don't know the whole story, or there must have been a reason, which causes a feeling and an action or inaction. These are the examples of the ways that white supremacy with messaging gets into our mindset, which has an effect on our actions. And this is why being anti-racist is a conscious effort. So yes, all white supremacists are racist. However, you do not have to be a white supremacist to have racist thoughts or take racist action or inaction. We all have racist thoughts. So no matter who you are, if you grew up in a white-dominated Western society, we all have racist thoughts. Now, if you hear that and you feel defensive or judged, I really encourage you to sit with that. Sit with that feeling and get curious of, why am I feeling defensive? Why do I not want to believe this? And dive into that. It's all of our individual responsibility to recognize that we have racist thoughts and change them. Uncovering our thoughts is work, examining our thoughts is work, changing them is work. This work is necessary to change your actions, inactions, my actions, inactions. This is why it's conscious effort. So I love this image. And this is in the resource and linked. This is from the John T. Milton Department of Medicine. So this is a figure that kind of depicts the different zones of becoming anti-racist. I'm not going to go through this in detail. You can look at it later, but the fear zone, when you're in a place of denying racism, wanting to stay in the zone of comfort, or you're in the learning zone. You recognize it's a problem, you're trying to learn, you're still vulnerable, you're still a little defensive, but you recognize that that's part of the system of white supremacy and that perpetrates racism. Or you're in the growth zone. You're able to sit with your discomfort, you're able to recognize when you mess up, apologize, move forward. You really promote anti-racism. So you can be, it's not linear. You can move forward into the learning zone and then, have some time where you're back in the fear zone. The system of white supremacy wants that to happen, and it works very hard for that to happen. You could be in the learning zone at work, but at home still be in the fear zone. I think it's really helpful to recognize where you're at so you can move forward. So where do we start? Education, reflection, radical self-honesty. And again, some of you have been doing this for a long time. Some of you are just starting. It's not linear. So no matter where you are in your anti-racist journey, you can continue this process of education, reflection, radical self-honesty. And I'm going to talk about how that's necessary. So learning, unlearning, and relearning. So what does that look like? Well, there's a couple of different ways we need to focus. So one is learning what systematic racism really looks like, both historically and present day, and how they connect. So I'm going to share a few examples. I'm going to only share about 5. If you have others, feel free to put them in the chat box. And I'm not going to go through and provide the history, but I'm going to prompt you to start thinking about this. Black codes. Do you know about the Reconstruction period and what black codes were? And how did that lay the foundation for Jim Crow, which lays the foundation for things like mass incarceration? Redlining. We talked a little bit about this in an earlier session, but how does redlining actually relate to black codes? How did redlining relate to the 2008 discriminatory practices that caused a recession? How does it relate to neighborhood segregation now and the impacts that we're seeing in COVID? School segregation. We know about Brown versus Board of Education, but what else is there? Like, what's the history before that and since then? And how does this relate to privatizing schools today Voter suppression and voting rights. What's the history of that? We may know about the Voting Rights Acts, but what are the names besides John Lewis and Martin Luther King who were part of that fight? There's a lot of folks that were part of that fight that we're not taught about. I encourage you to seek out that information. And then how has voter suppression really morphed over the past decades? And who today in our country still does not have the right to vote? Because there's a lot of people who do not, for example, formerly incarcerated persons. And then, Christians in the church. And I've been really proud and to be a part of Living Hope and hearing PB speak about this and others. And I think it's really important if you're going to be anti-racist, particularly as a Christian, that this is a part, and it's uncomfortable. It is really uncomfortable and you're going to feel challenged, but it's really important that you dive into this. Some of the other areas, and let's see, healthcare, research, higher education, there's a lot more. We're not going to go through them all, but this is, one area to dive into is systematic racism. Another area is learning what individual perpetration of racism, oppression, discrimination, harm, and bias really looks like. What it looks like when you might be, kind of making whiteness the norm or saying it's the norm and saying blackness or brownness is not. And understanding this is really key, understanding how this harms others. So this really ties into building relationships and one tongue, one tribe that we heard earlier. So again, things like understanding what the impact is when someone says, no, where are you really from? Or racial gaslighting. And I provided a link to that image in the resource guide. Or what's the impact when a white person touches a black woman's hair? And why does that matter? And what harm does that cause? Or the idea of, reverse racism, things like that, diving into that kind of individual level and how that perpetrates and how that is existing in your psyche and your experience. And then learning what anti-racism looks like and what it does not. Understanding the ways you as an individual can show up as anti-racist and ways that you are not. And everyone, white folks, BIPOCs, we all need to work to be anti-racist because, as I said, of the society and the messaging we grow up in. So I encourage all of you to get, dive into what these terms mean. Tone policing. If you want to be anti-racist, I think you really need to know what tone policing is and watch yourself if you're doing that. Spiritual bypassing. I think if you're a Christian or any person of faith, you really need to dive into what that means and our role. What does being a co-conspirator really look like? What does it not look like? How can you, as someone who's trying to be anti-racist, also perpetrate microaggressions, right? So these are terminologies that are important to understand and learn about. And then the next piece, around education is reflection and radical self-honesty. So you need to do internal reflection and assessment. We all do, myself included. And these are just some questions that I thought of for this presentation. There's so many more. So things like, what is the stereotype I believe about a community of color? In what ways have I kept doors of opportunity shut to any person of color? How are the ways I spend money supporting oppressive systems? In what ways does my civic engagement, voting, volunteering, etc., oppress communities of color? In what areas of my life do I exclude perspectives of a community of color, for example, books or TV? You gotta be really honest with yourself and you have to ask these questions. If you want to dive into this, I really recommend this book by Layla Saad. Again, it's in the resources, Me and White Supremacy. It's a book that you learn and do. So you read, you understand more about white supremacy, and there's lots of prompts, activities for you to really dive in to your experience, no matter who you are with white supremacy. It's very, very powerful. So where do you go, right? You're doing education, you're doing reflection. You need to do both internal and external action. So internal, you need to be monitoring and self-correcting. So actively observing your thinking to address or challenge any racist thoughts. When you feel defensive about being called out for racist thoughts or behaviors, sit with that discomfort. Take time to learn, get curious. And when you make a mistake, say or do something racist or oppressive, apologize authentically, learn from it, and do better. We're gonna mess up. We're humans. We're in a white supremacist, white dominated society that perpetrates racism for hundreds of years. Acknowledge what you did, learn from it, do better. Do not let that stop you on your journey. And then external action. So this is so, so important. If you're just educating yourself and doing reflection, that's great. But if you do not take external action, then how are you changing the experience of oppression for others? How are you stopping racism? How are you stopping the harm that others experience from that? So there's a lot of ways that you can do external action. Here are just a few examples. And it's not about doing them all at once per se, right? But about taking action. Having uncomfortable conversations with family and friends. You got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Join an organization with a BIPOC-led anti-racist agenda. Provide financial contributions to BIPOC-led organizations doing racial equity work. Be conscious about what you purchase and where you shop. Participate in civic engagement activities that do promote racial justice. And for my white folks on the call, I really want to encourage you, your external actions should be informed by what communities of color are saying they need from you, how they need you to show up. This is extremely, extremely important because communities of color know what changes they want to see. It's not our job as white people to determine that. It's our job to support them in that. And I really want to say, don't underestimate your sphere of influence. I think a lot of times there's this thought of, well, it doesn't really matter. Not that many people will follow me on social media, or my family's never going to change. It doesn't matter if you don't need to be the CEO of your company. You have a sphere of influence, right? You have your family and friends, your community, your church, your work, and children. If you have children, it's a great opportunity to really influence having anti-racist, anti-biased children. So don't underestimate it. And it's not by numbers, it's quality and moving people forward. I love this quote by Rachel Cargill. She's really speaking to white folks, but really this can be applied to anyone. Anti-racism work is not self-improvement space for white people. If protecting bodies and empowering Black lives aren't at the center of your work, then you're not here for Black people. You're simply going through the motions to make your white self feel better. And if you're a white person who feels called out there, again, please sit with your discomfort, because the goal of being anti-racist should be to end oppression and violence and harm against others, against communities of color. Now, if you're on an anti-racist journey, you're working at it and you don't become more empathetic, more humble, more kind, then something's off for sure. But if you're being anti-racist and doing anti-racism work just to pat yourself on the back, then you're missing the whole point. So I'm again going to do another discussion question. So we've talked a little bit about starting, like educating yourself, reflecting, doing some internal, external action. What prevents us from continuing the work, right? We see this a lot where there's a big incident and folks get engaged, but then maybe it's not in the news as much, friends aren't as engaged, and maybe kind of like less incentivized to participate. But what really prevents us from continuing the work? And it's a long journey and it's work. What prevents us? Please write in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself. Like, what do you think based on what we've kind of outlined today and talked about? Compassion fatigue. I had someone in a training call this grace fatigue, particularly, and she was a woman of color, talking about giving a lot of grace, particularly to white folks, and kind of getting exhausted of providing that grace. Complacency. Yeah, absolutely. Any others?
I was going to say that I get like a hopelessness sometimes, and now that we're talking about more of this stuff, I'm seeing that as like a white savior complex that I wasn't aware of.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. Brian says secondary trauma, feeling overwhelmed. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not speaking as someone with this experience. I've never experienced racism, but white people need to recognize that anti-racism work, yes, is a lot of work for us, but for people of color, doing anti-racism work while also experiencing racism is traumatic, and it is some may call it a burden. I don't know if that's the appropriate word, so please let me know. If not, it can feel overwhelmed. And again, I'm not speaking from personal experience, but it's important we recognize that. Any others? Okay. Oh, I'm gonna move us forward. So I'm going to go back to this as far as the reason of why not continuing for a lot of folks is that white supremacy as a system is designed to suppress our acknowledgement, interest, investment, empathy, and action. And it does this in a couple ways. So it's not just, suppressing and preventing us from starting, but even continuing, right? It's part of the system is things like thoughts of like, I'm not going to make a difference, or I did enough, or, for folks who are, in communities of color, people of color, white supremacy also works, and it's important for white folks to know this. Racism, as Brian was speaking of, secondary trauma, feeling overwhelmed. Okay, Brian, we can say comfortable, thanks. Sandra says, our unwillingness to sit in discomfort. From what I'm hearing is that racism goes back to learned behavior, and this can travel back generational lines in our families. This would mean that we would need to allow ourselves to feel uncomfortable with new ways of thinking and seeing the new lens that we can be uncomfortable. Oh yeah, beautifully said, yes. So examples of some ways to help you stay engaged long-term. I find it's helpful to do this not alone, to stay motivated and engaged. And also I didn't put this here, but now it's coming to my mind, to focus on positive changes that you've seen, whether you were a part of enacting or, other groups, organizations. So that's not here, but that's really important. But you can join, an anti-racism or racial equity organization, start an anti-racism book club, join a racial equity committee at your work, identify an accountability partner, a friend, a spouse, to go through, have conversations together. Really important. Where is the information you're getting coming from on your social media? Are you following some anti-racism racial equity accounts, independent journalists? And the last piece, which speaks to what Brian was talking about, is self-care. And so, this is not my content. I link this out, but particularly for Black, Indigenous, and people of color who, as I said before, doing anti-racism work while also experiencing racism. So here are some examples that were shared. Joy, laugh, see joy on your feed. Go to a space where you, feel seen, movement, nourishment. And not listed here, God, Bible, church. So again, this is shared from a person of color who's an anti-racist educator. So I'm not trying to white-splain anything. I just want to point this out, for everyone, and especially for white folks, to realize that part of the privilege you carry when you're doing anti-racism work is you're also not experiencing racism at the same time. So how to keep going. I made this visual. It's not the best. I couldn't find one that represented what I wanted to, but it's about both parallel and cyclical action, right? So a lie of white supremacy is that you must be fully educated, no longer racist at all before you take action. That's just not true, and we would never take action if we believed that. So it both needs to be in parallel and cyclical, right? Constantly learning and learning, questioning, challenging, reflecting and assessing, taking action. So you may learn something and then reflect on it, or you may learn something and then take action, or you may question something and challenge it and then reflect, right? So it's like a constant cycle. It's not in a specific order, and all of these components need to be happening. So with that, I'm so proud of myself on time here. We have about 3 discussion questions, so I want us to dive a little bit deeper into this. Given this is about, starting your anti-racist journey and kind of moving forward or continuing your journey, I want to hear from you all. What are you going to do in the next week to take internal assessment, education, or action to be anti-racist? Chat box, phone. What's one thing you can do in the next week? There's no right or wrong, right? And I think it's really helpful to kind of like commit and to say and to speak it out. Nicole, I'm going to look into what spiritual bypassing is. So there's a great podcast episode from First Name Basis, which is linked in my resources. Jasmine Bradshaw, she is a Christian and she's an anti-racist educator for parents. She has an episode on spiritual bypassing. I highly recommend it. Siobhan, I want to seek an accountability buddy to start sharing content and discussions. Yeah, great. Grace, to do more research in the resources provided to educate yourself. Yeah, absolutely. And the resources I put together are through, a lot of them were created by graduate students from different schools of public health, because that's where I work, and different communities. Brian, participate in the ARC prayer meeting about anti-racism and justice. Yes, that's awesome. I love that. Any others? Tiffany, I will self-assess my own thoughts and see how I can change if need be. Yeah, absolutely. That's a big piece of it. If you meditate or you yoga, or, for whatever reason, we're actively conscious of your thoughts. But many of us are not taught to do that. So it does take a lot of work to start being conscious of what we're thinking, even on the kind of bringing stuff from the subconscious to the conscious level. And it's a practice. It's a lifelong practice. Brian, discuss with my roommates and family members about ideas I'm learning about associated with anti-racism. Yeah, absolutely. So similarly, what are folks going to do in the next week to take any external action? And it doesn't have to be big, again, don't minimize external efforts, whether it's sharing a resource with a friend, or just looking in, whether you want to take political action and call your senator over an issue, or you want to kind of get involved at work or school. Any ideas in the next week? And I want to challenge everyone, if you are hearing these questions and you're feeling shame or any kind of feeling that's preventing you from feeling like you can take any action, I want you to dive into why you're feeling or thinking that way. And really think back to what we were talking about with how our thoughts are influenced by kind of our whole life and prior generations and messages we see in society. Any thoughts? What are you going to do the next week to take any external anti-racist action? Pamela, I'm part of an accountability text group. That's awesome. I'm the only white person. They allow me to ask questions and I'll ask them about some of these things. We have great discussions. Also, I've worked on voter rights cases, thinking about getting involved again. I love that. Accountability text group. What a great idea. I've never heard of that. Yeah, and I think another thing I've learned, and I don't have it listed here, that I've experienced particularly in the past year is kind of some thoughts and feelings, which, I recognize are designed and strategic by white supremacy, to feel like I need to be doing everything and then I don't do very much. And so I've been working on how can I have constraint. So, in what area am I really going to focus? Am I going to focus really on voting rights? That is something I'm really passionate about. Am I going to really focus on racism and health? I work in health. I work in public health. What are maybe, I've been working on what's one area I really want to focus more on, political action or in the church, right? So you don't have to do it all. And sometimes the desire of feeling like you have to do it all, you can get overwhelmed and not move forward at all. Janice, I'm glad you mentioned that self-care is important too. It's so easy to be overwhelmed by all of this information and wanting to fix everything right away. Yeah, absolutely. I had S-Ray Peoples in a session I was in with her said, for her, and I have this too, she said, for me, recognizing racism is not going to be solved in the next year, 5 years, 10 years is helpful. Now, that thought might not be helpful for everyone. I want to recognize that. That thought might cause feelings for folks that are not helpful. But for her, that was a thought that helped her feel like, okay, I don't need to fix it all. It's going to take time. Others might want the thought of like, every little thing I do will contribute to this change, right? Like, how can you think on purpose ways that create, instead of overwhelm and shame, create feelings of motivation and hope, right?
Can I jump in here?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. First of all, this has been amazing. Absolutely. You're killing this, Marissa.
Thanks,
and we're really appreciative of what you're giving us today. I think I resonate with and my wife just wrote here in the chat about self-care and how we need to incorporate this in our journey. Because early on, I was having such intensive conversations, and so many of them a day, that, I remember at the end of 1 week, my blood pressure was 176/115. And I realized I'm going to kill myself if I continue to move at this pace. I guess the question I would ask is, how do we deal with, because the hard part about it is, the fact of the matter is, the people who need this presentation the most are not here. They're not joining us for this journey. The people who are on this call right now are the most open-hearted people. But the people that we have to deal with are the ones who would actually not be interested in sitting through a presentation like this, for a number of reasons. And so I guess the question would be, how do we deal with, because, for me as an Enneagram 7, I'm always feeling like I'm on the verge of the perfect piece of information that's actually going to solve the problem. You know what I mean? And if I just learn a little bit more, if I just read one more book, if I just sit in on one more seminar, I'll find that missing piece that's going to actually enable me to communicate with the level of clarity and power necessary to open people's eyes. And that doesn't happen. And so how do I remain emotionally and mentally healthy, or pursue emotional and mental health on this journey?
Yeah, I think that's so great. You bring up kind of 2 points. I want to talk about what you just asked around self-care and the desire to constantly keep going. I think it's helpful to ask yourself very powerful questions, like, in what ways does me taking time out actually make me a better anti-racist, make me better prepared to do this work? In what ways does doing this self-care act actually is an action against white supremacy and is ensuring that it can continue this work? Like, how can we reframe our thinking to see self-care and times out as a way that helps us be better anti-racists and contributors? So I think powerful questions, because our go-to thought are those thoughts that have been programmed. So how do we get us to kind of think different ways? Questions. If you ask your brain a question, it's going to go find it, right? It's like when you do Control F in Word to like search for a word, your brain's going to do that. I think the piece you also talked about is, someone sees a title, Starting Your Anti-Racist Journey, you're here because you recognize something, that racism exists, or that you want to get involved. People who read that title, who, choose not to come here, a lot of them, it's because they don't recognize racism or don't believe they're part of the problem. And so how do we reach them? I think part of it goes back to earlier talking about building bridges, right? And so a lot of it, that's why the sphere of influence, those relationships you have with people in your community who, maybe you already have a bridge built with them and you haven't discussed racism, or, they haven't come to anything like this. Like, how can you use that bridge to open up a conversation? And I think this morning's session really helped talk through like the challenges of that. How do you do that? Some of the difficulty that may come up, but also some of the opportunities. And so that's why I always say, don't underestimate your sphere of influence. And also don't underestimate the impact of just like speaking to one person's heart that may just turn just like a little dial. Maybe you don't see 10 years down the road, they really turn a lot. So you might not know how that seed has grown for them, but remind yourself, I might be planting a seed that God is going to water and things may change and I may not see it, and that's okay. Like, I can accept that. Thanks, PB. Other questions? I think we have like 8 minutes, so I'd love to hear folks' questions, or if other folks have reflections. The other question I had here was accountability, but folks have kind of already talked about that. So I'd love, if there are other questions or folks want to share their own experience or, perspectives.
Yeah, I have a question.
Mhm.
I want to just thank you so much. This is so helpful course, and I think I have a question about like if you could speak about like motivation and and even like either personally from you or even from a faith perspective, like where I think I know like the general like folks motivations like racism is bad, but and it's harmful, but like drive and motivation for people to continue to pursue anti-racist. And I think speaking from like an East Asian person, we experience racism, but often we may have a privilege where we can go on with our life without not actively addressing anti-racism. And in the long term, it impacts us, but in the short term, we could just put our heads down and just continuing on, and it feels like our life isn't impacted. So if you could speak a little bit about like motivation or yeah, and yeah.
Yeah, I think, thank you for asking that. I think what you're speaking to is, again, it's really a function of the system of white supremacy where even if certain communities have less power, only power in certain situations or privileges, what happens is all of us, and particularly white folks, like it de-incentivizes us from doing something or continuing the work. And so I think part of it is recognizing when that's happening. And let me be specific, not to shame yourself. I really believe the feeling of shame does not produce any positive results, right? I do not believe God gives us shame at all. And so I think it's really important not to shame yourself and get in the mindset of, okay, I recognize this. I'm actually going to kind of tell myself I'm really proud of you for recognizing this, and I'm going to dive into it and see, what's happening here. I think, again, going back to the thoughts, I think it's important to say, what were the thoughts I was thinking? Like, was I thinking, oh, well, I really have something I need to do later and this isn't affecting me, so, that's more important. Let me dive into that. Why? Why do I think that? Why do I think it doesn't matter? Why do I think it's not my place? How in the long term is it important, right? Like, I think we really got to dive into our thinking much more so than we're taught to figure out, because our thoughts cause our feelings. So what thought is causing the kind of apathy or decision not to take action? And what's a different way I can think about it where I can feel motivation? Does that kind of speak to and answer your question?
Yeah, I think a bit like you're mentioning about like really digging deep about our thoughts, about like and asking why. Yeah, I think that addresses some of it, and I'm either wondering. Yeah, I think that for now that's good.
Thanks. I see some stuff in the chat box. So thanks for that question, Nicole, about specific moments, events that set you off in your anti-racism journey. Pamela says, racial trauma is a big deal for people of color. I have a hard time with the white church that says all they need is Jesus. That's kind of an aspect of spiritual bypassing. Absolutely. And, I'd love to hear if other folks have kind of moments they want to share. I think it's really powerful when we share our experiences that, have made us feel shame or unable to be anti-racist or continue our journey, so we can see like, we're not alone, and hear from each other of how we can work through that.
I can share a little bit of what I am experiencing or have experienced. So I work in the legal industry, and I feel like, especially as a new person in that career, like you don't want to be too controversial. And so I feel like that has stopped me from maybe starting these conversations in the workplace. And it has been discussed a couple times, but it's been like times where the boss isn't there because no one wants to rock the boat, and it's just like a few of us younger people there, so we feel more comfortable. And yeah, I'm trying to be intentional going forward about not censoring myself to make other people comfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. And also to get uncomfortable with you being uncomfortable because
Yeah.
there's discomfort. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So I know today was kind of a lot, and I know going through this materials might have felt different depending on your lived experience, your perspective. It might have felt different if you're white or if you're a person of color. And so I just want to encourage you to do whatever you need to do this afternoon to process this or digest this. If you have feedback, positive, negative, constructive, I would love to hear it. I'm always trying to learn. I am not perfect. And I recognize I don't have the lived experience of everyone, just myself, actually. But I know we're at time. These are in that sheet. I actually wanted to close out with prayer. If that's okay with everyone. I know there's a little bit of a break, but I know for some this was a lot and could have brought up some uncomfortable feelings in different ways. So I want to just close this out in prayer so that we can bring God to our hearts and whatever we may need, you know, in the next couple hours, couple days, whatever it may be. So, dear Lord, first, I just want to thank you so much for how you have really spoken through PB and PS and Living Hope and really brought them to be leaders in speaking out against racism and racial injustice. And I want to thank you for bringing us all together today here for the sermon. And thank you for bringing every participant here for all the sessions today. And what I ask, Lord, is that you tend to each of these individuals in the way that they need to be tended to, speak to them in the way they need to hear you, and touch their heart. Whether that's they need guidance from you or motivation, or they have questions of how to continue, challenging questions, or they're experiencing some traumatic feelings regarding their experiences. Lord, do not let them feel alone. Let them know that you are here with them and that you are calling them, and speak to them about what their role is in this anti-racist journey and in dismantling racism, how you are going to call them to the church, to their community, to their family, to their work. I just pray, Lord, that you allow everyone here to discern your voice and to be able to hear from you how you are asking them to show up, and also let them know what you know they need and provide that for them, for their healing, for their ability to keep going, for their ability to do great things through your word and through your journey. And Lord, I just thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.